Rachel Carter walked through the convenience store aisles, her focus on the weekly grocery list in her hand. For the residents of the town, she was just another face in the crowd, which was exactly how Rachel liked it. The town had been her temporary home for a few months now, and the quiet suited her. The cover was simple enough. An introverted, single woman working remotely for an out-of-town accounting firm. That background gave her the freedom to move without raising eyebrows, a vital component for an undercover FBI agent tasked with investigating a group that operated under the radar. Rachel took her time choosing a few items, carefully assessing each one. Her senses were heightened, her mind alert. She noticed a group of bikers lounging outside the store's entrance when she entered. A quick glance confirmed they were members of the Iron Serpents, a local biker gang that had made a reputation for themselves over the years. Their presence in town was a point of pride for them and a source of dread for others. Rachel had been tailing the Iron Serpents for months, gathering evidence on their suspected involvement in drug trafficking and illegal arms trades. Her FBI assignment was strictly to observe and report, but Rachel had never been one to back down from a confrontation if one arose. She knew the risks, but they were part of the job, a job she was very good at. After paying for her items, Rachel walked calmly to the exit. As she neared the door, the men looked up, their stares laced with amusement and interest. Rachel didn't flinch, keeping her face neutral. Stay calm, she reminded herself. She dealt with worse than a few thugs with bruised egos and overinflated pride. "Hey there, sweetheart," one of the men called out as she stepped into the sunlit parking lot. His voice was low and taunting, filled with a smug arrogance that irritated Rachel more than she cared to admit. She made a mental note of the speaker, tall, heavily tattooed, with a leather vest that boasted the Iron Serpent's insignia. Ignoring them, she kept walking toward her car, maintaining her calm demeanor. They were looking for a reaction, hoping to intimidate her into acknowledging their dominance over the town. Rachel had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. "Where you off to in such a hurry?" another one taunted, stepping in her path. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. His overbearing smirk faltered for a second as her gaze remained unbroken. Behind him, the gang's leader, Razor, watched with a slight smirk, as if waiting for her to make the next move. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice even. She stepped to the side, moving past the man with measured steps. He reached out, grabbing her by the arm, his fingers tightening in a rough grip. "Ah, come on now. Just trying to be friendly," he sneered, tightening his hold. In one fluid motion, Rachel twisted her arm out of his grip, stepping back and keeping her stance calm but ready. She had been trained in defensive techniques, her body conditioned to respond under pressure without hesitation. Her move startled him, but his expression quickly shifted from surprise to anger. Razor stepped forward, chuckling darkly. "A feisty one, huh? You don't seem to know who you're dealing with, missy." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "And you don't know who you're messing with," she replied, her voice low but firm. The gang members fell silent for a moment, taken aback by her composure. Razor's smirk widened, clearly viewing her as a challenge, not a threat. He took a step closer, towering over her as he leaned in. "Is that so?" he murmured. "Well, maybe we should get to know each other a little better." Rachel didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "I don't think you're ready for that," she replied. Razor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone within earshot. "Guess we'll see about that." With that, he backed off, gesturing for his men to follow him. Rachel watched them leave, feeling their stares linger on her until they were out of sight. She exhaled slowly, checking the tension in her shoulders as she climbed into her car. She knew Razor would be back. Men like him didn't take well to being embarrassed, especially not in front of their crew. She drove home, her mind already formulating a plan. She'd have to alert her FBI team about the incident, but something told her that Razor and his men wouldn't let things go so easily. And that was exactly what she'd been counting on. Rachel Carter drove back to her rented home in silence, the roar of her car engine steady as her mind churned over the encounter with the Iron Serpents. Every instinct in her screamed that this wasn't over. Razor and his crew were not the type to take humiliation lightly, and their bruised egos would push them to act recklessly. It was the perfect opportunity for her to expose them fully. Her modest one-story house sat on the outskirts of town, flanked by open fields and thick woods. It was the kind of place that felt secluded, where the sounds of the night were the only backdrop. To the untrained eye, it was nothing special, just another house with peeling paint and a cluttered yard. To Rachel, it was a fortress. She had spent weeks covertly turning it into a surveillance hub and a trap for anyone foolish enough to threaten her. As soon as she stepped inside, Rachel locked the door behind her and set the security system to active mode. The slight hum of its activation was a comfort. She placed her groceries on the counter and walked straight to her office, a small room tucked at the back of the house. Here, monitors glowed faintly, displaying feeds from strategically hidden cameras around the property. Motion sensors had been embedded in the driveway, by the porch, and along the backyard fence. She sat at her desk and grabbed her secure phone to call Agent Marcus Green, her partner and closest confidant. "Rachel," Marcus answered after the first ring. "You okay?" "Fine," she said briskly. "But things escalated today. Razor and his crew cornered me outside the grocery store." There was a pause on the other end before Marcus sighed. "You think they'll retaliate?" "No doubt about it," Rachel replied, her voice calm but firm. "Men like Razor thrive on dominance. I embarrassed him in front of his men. That's not something he'll let go." "You're right," Marcus said, his tone growing serious. "Do you want me to escalate the timeline? We can bring the team in tonight." "Not yet," Rachel said. "If we act now, we'll risk losing key evidence. The Serpents are tied to a bigger operation, arms deals and drug trafficking networks. We need them to come to me. They'll bring their arrogance, and that's when we take them down." Marcus hesitated before responding. "All right, but I'm stationing the SWAT team nearby. If they show up, we'll be ready." "Thanks," Rachel said. "I'll signal you as soon as it's time." After ending the call, Rachel leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment to process. Marcus's concern was warranted. Her mission had always been dangerous, and the Iron Serpents were known for their violent tactics. But Rachel wasn't afraid. She thrived in high-pressure situations, and this was no different. Rachel spent the next few hours preparing for the inevitable. She moved methodically, checking and rechecking every detail. The house's alarm system had been modified to send silent alerts directly to her phone. She tested it twice, ensuring no glitches. She double-checked her camera feeds, making minor adjustments to the angles to ensure no blind spots. The feeds captured a full view of her driveway, porch, and the rear perimeter of the house. Even if Razor's crew tried sneaking in through the woods, she'd spot them long before they got close. Next, Rachel retrieved a small box from a hidden compartment under the kitchen floor. Inside were the tools of her trade, defensive gadgets she had relied on during countless missions. She laid them out on the counter. A compact stun gun, fully charged. A small canister of pepper spray. A collapsible baton, lightweight but strong enough to incapacitate. A hidden alert button she could carry discreetly in her pocket, ready to trigger the FBI backup. Each item was tested and carefully placed in accessible locations around the house. Rachel also set up a few surprises, traps that wouldn't seriously injure anyone but would incapacitate them long enough for her to regain control. The porch was fitted with a concealed spray mechanism loaded with pepper spray. Anyone standing too close to the front door for too long would get a face full of burning deterrent. Near the windows, she placed small motion-activated sound devices designed to emit a high-pitched noise loud enough to disorient intruders. She moved through the house like a surgeon, precise and unflinching. Every trap, every camera, every defensive measure was part of a larger plan. A plan to draw the Iron Serpents in and show them that they had picked the wrong target. As night fell, Rachel stood by the window, staring out at the darkened road leading to her house. The streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway, their dim glow creating an eerie stillness. She sipped a cup of tea, her eyes never leaving the street. Waiting was always the hardest part. Her training had taught her patience, but the anticipation of action always made her heart race. The night was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But Rachel knew better than to trust the calm. Razor and his crew were creatures of habit, They thrived on the cover of darkness, their confidence growing when they believed no one was watching. Her instincts were proven right when, shortly after midnight, a faint rumble echoed in the distance. She set her cup down and walked to her desk, her fingers typing quickly to bring up the camera feeds. The rumble grew louder, and soon the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines filled the air. The Iron Serpents had arrived. The arrival. Rachel watched as the gang's motorcycles rolled into view on the camera feeds. Razor led the pack, his bike larger and more decorated than the others. Behind him, his crew followed. 7 men in total, their figures hulking and menacing as they dismounted and surveyed her property. She noted their movements, cataloging their weapons and body language. Most carried knives, and 2 had visible firearms holstered at their sides. Razor gestured to his crew, barking orders that Rachel couldn't hear through the cameras. They spread out, some approaching the front porch while others circled around the sides of the house. Rachel's pulse quickened, but her hands remained steady as she grabbed the alert button and slipped it into her pocket. She walked to the front door, her movements calm and deliberate, and unlocked it. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The Iron Serpents thought they were the hunters, but they were about to realize they had become the prey. The deep rumble of motorcycles filled the night air, vibrating through the ground like an ominous warning. Rachel sat quietly at her desk, monitoring the cameras as the Iron Serpents arrived. 7 figures dismounted their bikes, their shadows stretching long in the dim light. Razor, their leader, stood at the center, exuding an air of smug authority as he surveyed the property. "All right, boys," Razor said, his voice carrying through the stillness of the night. "Let's show her what happens when you cross the Iron Serpents." The men laughed, their confidence bolstered by their numbers and their leader's bravado. Armed with knives, chains, and a few visible firearms, they split up, moving toward the house with predatory intent. Rachel watched their movements closely, noting their positions on the monitors. She recognized the overconfidence in their strides, the assumption that their presence alone would be enough to intimidate her. But Rachel Carter was no ordinary woman. She had chosen this fight, and she was ready. Rachel stood just inside her front door, her heart steady as she waited for the inevitable knock, or, more likely, the pounding fists of a man like Razor. She had set her traps perfectly, and now it was time to let them spring. One of the gang members approached the front porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He gestured for another to follow, their whispered voices barely audible over the quiet hum of the night. "She's in there," one of them muttered. "Probably scared out of her mind." The other chuckled darkly. "Let's give her a real reason to be scared." The man on the porch raised his fist and pounded on the door. "Open up, sweetheart. We just want to talk." Inside, Rachel smiled faintly. She reached for the conceal button near the doorframe and pressed it, activating the first trap. A burst of pressurized pepper spray shot out from a hidden nozzle above the door, hitting both men square in the face. They stumbled back, coughing and clawing at their eyes as they cursed loudly. "Son of a... what the hell?" one of them yelled, doubling over in pain. Their commotion drew the attention of Razor, who was standing near the driveway, barking orders to the others. He strode toward the porch, his expression darkening as he took in the sight of his men writhing on the ground. "What's going on?" Razor growled. She sprayed us with something." One of the men managed to gasp, his eyes red and streaming. Razor's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "Get out of the way," he snapped, shoving past them. He motioned for 2 others to circle around to the back of the house. "Find another way in." As Razor regrouped his men, Rachel moved to her office, keeping an eye on the monitors. 2 gang members were creeping along the side of the house, their silhouettes faintly illuminated by the moonlight. She activated the high-pitched sound emitters near the side windows. The sharp, disorienting noise sent them reeling, their hands flying to their ears as they stumbled away from the house. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted, his voice muffled by his attempts to block the sound. "It's a trap," the other yelled, retreating toward the driveway. Inside, Rachel felt a surge of satisfaction. The traps were working perfectly, but she knew it wouldn't take long for Razor to grow desperate. Men like him thrived on control, and the more he lost it, the more dangerous he would become. Razor's frustration boiled over as he watched his crew falter. He pulled a handgun from his waistband and pointed it at the front door. "Enough of this," he bellowed. "You want to play games, lady? Fine. Let's see how tough you really are." Rachel's voice came through a small speaker mounted near the porch, calm and steady. "Put the gun down, Razor. You're only making things worse for yourself." The sudden sound startled Razor, and he whipped around, trying to locate its source. "Where are you?" he demanded. "Come out here and face me." "I'm right here," Rachel replied, her voice almost mocking. "But I think you already know how this ends." Razor's face twisted in rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think hiding behind traps and tricks makes you better than us?" "No," Rachel said. "What makes me better is that I'm prepared. And I'm not afraid of you." Her words struck a nerve, and Razor fired a shot at the door, the sound echoing through the night. The bullet splintered the wood but didn't penetrate far enough to reach her. Inside, Rachel stayed calm, her hand poised over the silent alert button. The shot was the signal Rachel had been waiting for. She pressed the alert button, sending a distress signal directly to Agent Marcus Green and the nearby FBI team. Within minutes, the faint sound of sirens began to grow in the distance, accompanied by the rumble of approaching vehicles. Razor's crew froze as the realization hit them. The sirens grew louder, and the unmistakable glow of red and blue lights appeared on the horizon. Razor turned toward the driveway, his face a mix of confusion and fury. "What's going on?" one of the gang members asked nervously. Razor clenched his fists, his mind racing. "No, she didn't." Rachel's voice came through the speaker again, this time laced with quiet triumph. "You messed with the wrong woman, Razor." The FBI vehicle screeched to a halt in front of the house, and agents poured out, their weapons drawn. Marcus Green stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. "FBI, drop your weapons and get on the ground." The Iron Serpents hesitated, their bravado evaporating in the face of overwhelming force. Razor, however, wasn't ready to give up. He turned back toward the house, his gun still in hand. "Come out here," he shouted. "I'm not done with you." Before he could take another step, Rachel opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. She stood tall, her expression calm and unyielding as she stared Razor down. "It's over," she said. "You've lost." Razor raised his gun, but before he could fire, an FBI agent tackled him to the ground, disarming him in one swift motion. The rest of the gang surrendered, their weapons clattering to the ground as they were handcuffed and led to the waiting vehicles. The yard was awash with the flashing red and blue lights of FBI vehicles. Razor, pinned to the ground by a burly FBI agent, struggled violently, shouting curses and threats at anyone within earshot. His bravado from earlier in the night had dissolved into pure desperation, but it was far too late for him or his crew to salvage the situation. Rachel stepped off the porch, her calm and collected demeanor striking a stark contrast to the chaos around her. She approached Marcus Green, who stood near the tactical van barking orders into a radio. "Good timing," she said, her voice steady. Marcus gave her a quick once-over, noting her unscathed appearance. "You handled it perfectly." "They didn't know what hit them." Rachel smirked faintly. "They thought I was just another woman to intimidate. Turns out they were wrong." The FBI agents moved efficiently, securing the Iron Serpents one by one. The gang members were handcuffed and lined up near the vehicles, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and humiliation. Rachel watched as Razor was hauled to his feet, his face twisted in fury as he glared at her. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You think you've won? I've got connections. I'll find you and I'll—" Before he could finish, Marcus stepped forward, cutting him off with a cold stare. "Save it for your lawyer, Razor. You've got a long list of charges to answer for. You don't know who you're messing with." Razor growled, his voice trembling with rage. "I've got people in high places." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here you are, caught and cuffed like the petty criminal you are." Razor's face flushed red, his body straining against the cuffs as he lunged forward. "I'll make you pay for this." Rachel didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her gaze steady and unyielding. You already made the mistake of underestimating me once, Razor. Don't make it twice. Her words silenced him, and for the first time that night, she saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. While the arrests were underway, Rachel and Marcus led a small team of agents to inspect the gang's motorcycles and belongings. Hidden compartments were quickly uncovered, revealing stacks of cash, bags of illicit drugs, and several unregistered firearms. The discoveries were meticulously catalogued, adding to the growing pile of evidence against the Iron Serpents. "This is even bigger than we thought," Marcus said, holding up a ledger found in Razor's saddlebag. It was filled with coded entries detailing transactions for weapons and drugs. This could tie them to the larger trafficking network. Rachel nodded. "This is the break we've been waiting for. With this evidence, we can start dismantling their entire operation." As they continued searching, one of the agents uncovered a set of burner phones, each containing a list of contacts that pointed to suppliers and buyers across state lines. Rachel's suspicions about the Iron Serpent's connections to organized crime were confirmed, and the scope of the case expanded significantly. "This will bury them," Marcus said, handing the phones to another agent for analysis. Back in the yard, Razor sat in the back of a squad car, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He watched helplessly as his crew was loaded into other vehicles, their confident postures now slumped in defeat. The flashing lights illuminated Rachel as she conferred with Marcus, her composed demeanor a sharp contrast to his simmering rage. For the first time, Razor began to understand the full extent of his mistake. He had assumed Rachel was just another civilian, someone to intimidate and control. Instead, she had been his undoing, an FBI agent who had played him like a pawn in her larger game. His mind raced, trying to piece together how everything had unraveled so quickly. The humiliation of being outsmarted burned in his chest, but deeper still was a growing sense of regret. He had underestimated her, and now his empire was crumbling because of it. As the FBI vehicles prepared to leave, Marcus approached Rachel with a satisfied nod. "That's a wrap. We've got more than enough to charge them with everything from assault to trafficking." Rachel crossed her arms, her eyes scanning the scene. "It's not just about the arrests. It's about sending a message to them and to everyone like them. They think they can intimidate, manipulate, and control people without consequences. Tonight proves they're wrong." Marcus grinned. "And you made sure they'll never forget it." Nearby, Razor was being loaded into a transport van. He locked eyes with Rachel one last time, his expression a mixture of anger and reluctant respect. He opened his mouth as if to say something but closed it again, realizing there was nothing left to say. When the last vehicle pulled away, the yard fell silent once more. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Rachel stood alone on her porch, taking a moment to reflect on the night's events. Her mission wasn't over. There was still work to be done to dismantle the larger network the Iron Serpents were connected to. But tonight had been a victory, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. As she walked back inside, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Razor and his crew had underestimated her, but they wouldn't be the last to do so. She knew there would always be others who thought they could intimidate and dominate, but she also knew one thing for certain: she was more than ready for them. The dawn light crept over the horizon as Rachel Carter sat in her kitchen, sipping a strong cup of coffee. The events of the night had left her house eerily quiet, but Rachel's mind was anything but. Her thoughts churned over the evidence seized, the arrests made, and the next steps in the mission. Although Razor and the Iron Serpents were in custody, their takedown was only the beginning. The quiet morning was interrupted by the buzz of her secure phone. She picked it up to see Marcus's name flashing on the screen. "Good morning," she answered, her voice steady despite the long night. "Morning," Marcus said. His tone carried a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "The crew's being processed now. Razor hasn't stopped running his mouth, but we've got everything we need to keep him locked up." "Good," Rachel replied. "What about the evidence? Anything useful?" "More than useful," Marcus said. "That ledger we found in his saddlebag? It's a gold mine. Every transaction, every contact. He documented it all. It's enough to tie the Iron Serpents to at least 3 major trafficking networks. We've already flagged some of the names for follow-up, Rachel allowed herself a small smile. That's what we needed. This isn't just about taking down Razor. It's about dismantling the entire operation. Exactly, Marcus agreed. You did good, Rachel. We couldn't have pulled this off without you. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Thanks, Marcus. But we're not done yet. At the local FBI holding facility, Razor sat in a stark interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table in front of him. His once proud posture was slumped, and the anger in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Across the table sat an FBI interrogator, a man with years of experience breaking down even the toughest criminals. You've got two options here, Razor, the interrogator said, his voice calm but firm. You can cooperate, help us take down the bigger players in this operation, and maybe we'll consider cutting you a deal. Or you can keep stonewalling and go down with the ship. Razor sneered, but the expression lacked its usual confidence. You think you've got me figured out? I've got lawyers who'll tear this case apart. The interrogator leaned back in his chair, unfazed. You think this is just about you? We've got your entire crew's testimony, plus the evidence from your bikes, your hideouts, and that handy little ledger you were carrying around. You're not walking away from this, Razor. The only question is how much worse it's going to get for you. For the first time, Razor seemed to falter. His bravado had carried him through countless run-ins with the law, but this was different. This time, he wasn't just dealing with a local sheriff who could be bullied or bribed. He was up against the FBI, and they had him cornered. Back in town, news of the Iron Serpent's takedown spread quickly. The gang had long been a source of fear and intimidation, their presence a dark cloud over the community. With their arrest, that cloud began to lift, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Rachel had spent months blending into the fabric of the town, posing as an unassuming neighbor. Now, her true identity was out, and the townspeople regarded her with a mix of awe and gratitude. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her, their voices tinged with relief. At the local diner, an elderly man approached her table as she sipped her coffee. I just wanted to say, thank you, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Those men, they made life miserable for so many of us. You did something none of us thought was possible. Rachel smiled warmly. I was just doing my job. No, the man said, shaking his head. You did more than that. You gave us hope. Locked in a prison cell, Razor finally had time to reflect on the series of events that had led to his downfall. He replayed the night in his mind, his fists clenching as he thought about Rachel. She had outsmarted him at every turn, and the humiliation of being bested by a woman gnawed at him. But beneath the anger, a deeper emotion began to take root: regret. Razor had built his life around power and intimidation, believing himself untouchable. He had underestimated Rachel, and it had cost him everything. His gang was dismantled, his empire destroyed, and his name tarnished. For the first time in years, Razor felt the weight of his choices. He had always prided himself on being a leader, but now he saw the truth. He had led his crew straight into ruin. That evening, Rachel sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The quiet was a welcome change after the chaos of the night before. She sipped her tea, allowing herself a moment of peace before the next phase of the mission began. She knew the fight against crime was never truly over. There would always be another Razor, another gang, another threat to dismantle. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the victory. She had stood her ground, faced down the Iron Serpents, and proven that strength wasn't about physical power. It was about strategy, resilience, and courage. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. You're a legend. Rest up. We've got more work to do. Rachel smiled to herself. She wasn't looking for accolades or recognition. Her satisfaction came from knowing she had made a difference, from standing up to those who thought they could act without consequence. As the last light of the day faded, Rachel leaned back in her chair, her resolve stronger than ever. Razor and his crew had made the mistake of underestimating her, but they wouldn't be the last, and she would be ready for whatever came next. The following days unfolded with a sense of quiet victory. Razor and his crew faced their initial hearings, and the evidence Rachel and her team had collected left no room for doubt. The Iron Serpents were dismantled, their operations in shambles. Each gang member faced a laundry list of charges, from assault and illegal weapons possession to drug trafficking and racketeering. Razor, as their leader, bore the brunt of it all, facing the possibility of life behind bars. But for Rachel, the case was far from closed. The deeper ties uncovered in Razor's ledger revealed the breadth of the gang's operations. Contacts across state lines, payments to suppliers, and a trail of corruption that extended far beyond the borders of the small town. The work ahead was daunting, but Rachel felt a renewed sense of purpose. Razor's downfall was just the first domino to fall. In the weeks following the arrests, the town began to reclaim its sense of peace. Families that had once felt trapped in fear started venturing out again, and local businesses, no longer under the shadow of gang extortion, saw a revival. Rachel noticed the subtle changes during her morning walks. The way neighbors smiled and greeted one another, the lively chatter in the diner, and the absence of the heavy silence that had once hung over the streets. One afternoon, as she walked through the town square, a group of children ran past her, laughing and playing. Their carefree energy was contagious, and Rachel felt a rare moment of contentment. She had always been driven by a sense of duty, but seeing the tangible impact of her work reminded her of why she had chosen this path. Inside a stark federal courtroom, Razor stood before the judge, his demeanor a far cry from the confident gang leader he had once been. His lawyer's attempts to secure a plea deal had been shot down, leaving Razor with little hope of leniency. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the judge wasted no time in delivering a harsh sentence. As the gavel struck, Razor cast a final glance toward Rachel, who sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw in his expression a mixture of anger, regret, and begrudging respect. Razor had prided himself on being untouchable, but Rachel had shown him that no one was above accountability. Outside the courtroom, Marcus was waiting. "Well, that's that," he said as Rachel approached. "Razor's officially out of the game." "For now," Rachel replied. "But the network he was part of is still out there. We've cut off one head, but there are more to deal with." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. But this is a win, Rachel. Don't forget that." She gave him a small smile. "It's a step in the right direction." A few days later, Rachel received an unexpected letter in her mailbox. The handwriting was shaky, the envelope slightly wrinkled. Inside, she found a note from an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the town his entire life. The letter read, "Dear Miss Carter, I wanted to thank you for what you've done for our town. For years, we lived in fear of those men, watching them take and destroy without consequence. You didn't just bring them to justice, you gave us our lives back. I hope you know how much that means to people like me, who thought we'd never see change. You may not think of yourself as a hero, but to us, that's exactly what you are. Thank you." Gratefully, Harold Thompson. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, reading the letter twice before setting it down. She wasn't one for accolades, but the heartfelt words struck a chord. It was easy to get lost in the mechanics of her job, to focus on the next mission and the next threat. But this letter reminded her of the personal impact her work had on people's lives. That evening, Rachel met Marcus at a small cafe on the edge of town. They sat by the window, the soft murmur of conversation around them creating a soothing backdrop. "What's next?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. Rachel sipped her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "We follow the leads in Razor's ledger. There's a bigger network at play here, and I want to make sure it's dismantled completely." Marcus smiled wryly. "You don't take a day off, do you?" Rachel shrugged. "You know me. I'm not built for sitting still." He nodded, raising his cup in a mock toast. "To the unstoppable Rachel Carter. May the bad guys always underestimate you." She chuckled, clinking her cup against his. "And may we always prove them wrong." As Rachel drove home that night, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the landscape, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The mission had been a success, but it wasn't just about the arrests or the evidence. It was about standing up to those who thought they could act without consequence. It was about proving that strength didn't come from intimidation or violence, but from resilience, strategy, and the courage to fight for what was right.